good morning to Sir Tariq Khan Sahab and all the participants. Dear participants, today I would like you to meet Dr. Tariq Khan Sahab, who is a lecturer cum junior research officer in Central Institute of Indian Languages, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India. At present, he is an officer in charge also of NTM, who is our immediate boss. Myself, Abdul Halim, working in NTM. And he has been working in various capacities here in CIIL as well as Central Institute, Hyderabad Central University. He has earned his degree all from MA to PhD from Central University of Hyderabad and received his training in applied linguistics from SCU itself. His area of study or area of interest is is psycholinguistics, humor studies, sociolinguistics, writing system, translation and intercultural studies, and many more. Today, his topic is translation and cooperating disciplines. And most probably, I assume that he will talk about the interdisciplinary approaches to translation. And prior to coming CIIL, he has served as a guest faculty in the university in the Central University of Hyderabad. And I hope you will enjoy the lecture of Dr. Tariq Khan, translation and the cooperating disciplines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Halim and Dr. Aditya, dear esteemed colleagues from NTM and participants of this program and other interested senior experts who have also taken out time to join this session today. It's my pleasure to participate in the program and contribute to its academic value. As Dr. Halim has already mentioned, the topic that I intend to discuss today is translation and its cooperating disciplines. This in itself gives us an idea that things that I would like to discuss with you has to do with the various aspects of translation and its interdisciplinarity. So there may be an exclusive practice of translation, but then it may also serve as a cover term or as an umbrella term for several other activities, several other things that also go inside that. You can very well guess, since you have spent a week's time discussing translation and its theories, its practices, you yourself may also be able to guess the things that may follow in today's discussion. They are very important because sometimes they occur within the rubrics of translation and they do not receive the kind of attention that they deserve. So before coming to any topic within the discussion, let me bring before you some commonly accepted facts, some kind of a preliminary, some discussions that may be known to you, but that may require to be brought in again here. So if we take translation, interpretation and adaptation in their historical context or academic context, we may agree to the fact that these are all very, very old practices. These are not very new practices. These are the academic or say formal studies on them may be new, but the practices have been very, very old, whether it is translation or interpretation or adaptation. These are all activities which are quite old. How old? It's very difficult to say because languages have been there and several languages have been there. People have been talking for a long time and their communication would not have happened without, say, translation, without interpretation and without adaptation, because even the most important texts that we have things that we refer to are also available in multiple forms. They were also written. They were oral in the beginning and they were written down. Then they were put into different plays forms. So there have been several activities confirming that translation, interpretation, and adaptation have existed in India and in the world for a very long time. And since they have existed for a very long time, and since they are linguistic activities, they also offer us interesting points about languages, how languages work, how human mind functions, and things like that. So with that, we may be able to understand several other aspects of language. So if we are analyzing translation, or if we are working on translation, or if we are translating, similarly, if we are interpreting or analyzing interpretation, or if we are adapting, or if we are studying some instances of adaptation, we are basically analyzing language, and we are in a position to understand the way language works in the society. Therefore, translation, interpretation, and adaptation are also intellectual activities, and together they have contributed to the development of knowledge that we have today. So the wealth of knowledge that we have has to do with translation, interpretation, and adaptation activities. These are also professional activities which can be assigned to individuals, and that can generate revenues for them. Then these are also activities that have helped scientific developments. So if you consider the amount of knowledge an individual has today, or the wide range of technological equipments that we are using, they would not have been possible if translation, interpretation, and adaptations were not happening. We shall see all these things, and we shall also understand how this also contributes to the gross domestic product, how this contributes to the national economy. These are all some points that you might be fully aware of. I just wanted to highlight them to contextualize the other discussions that follow. So let us have a look at the three activities called translation, interpretation, and adaptation in slight more details, and then other discussions would also follow. So let us first take translation. There are various concepts within that. Translation serves as an umbrella term also for the three activities. Let us take translation per se, and this would refer to that activity of rendering a text into another language. So something written, something printed, available in a language is presented in some other language would be an instance of translation. This you are already aware of. Now, when you formally study this as a discipline, when you start understanding it, or when you start exploring it, when you start theorizing it, this becomes translation studies. So translation as a practice and translation studies as a discipline are two different things, but very, very interrelated. Similarly, you have interpretation and interpretation studies. The difference between translation and interpretation is that of modality. Translation exists at print and written format. So the text is available to you in written and printed form, whereas in interpretation, the text is available in oral and oral media. In adaptation, there is a change of media itself. There is a change of medium itself. So something written as a book is presented on the stage or is performed as a movie would amount to adaptation. So that accordingly, we have interpretation studies and adaptation studies. Let's see other related activities also, which will be clubbed under translation. So there is an instance where the requirement is not to translate the entire text into a different language, but only into a different script. For instance, the things that I'm speaking right now may start appearing to you in Roman script. So if you turn the caption on, like on the screen, you have an option to turn on the caption. like in the center of your bottom center of your screen, there is a button with the symbol CC, double C. If you click on double C, you'll notice that the captions are on. Now, whatsoever I'm speaking will appear to you in the Roman script. Now, this could also be possible to be presented in the Devanagari script, or if someone had to note down all these and then rewrites the same information in a different script, it would amount to what is called transliteration. When you are conversing with somebody on WhatsApp, when you are discussing some thing with someone on any text-based communication, you'll notice that you are doing such a practice. When you are, say, speaking Odia or Hindi or Tamil or Bangla, and you are using the Roman script, you are basically transliterating for the fact that there is a script that represents that language. When you are transliterating, you have the option to customize the rules as per your requirement. So if there is a shared understanding between the sender and the receiver, and with that shared understanding, you have the liberty to spell words according to your wishes, right? And this is what we are doing all the time. But when this becomes very systematized, when there are restrictions on how the spelling and pronunciations would follow, then what we do is we follow transcription. So when you use very systematic symbols like International Phonetic Alphabet, and you assign one letter to one sound or one sound to one letter, you are basically following what is called transcription. So these are two activities in which only script change is involved, and when you have relative liberty, you are transliterating. When you do not have that liberty and you are fixating to a set of symbols, it is transcription. Similarly, in the process, there can be a new development and a new product can come out. You have something called transcreation and transmutation. Then you have dubbing and subtitling. You are very familiar with these things. I have purposefully clubbed them all inside this slide. Then you have the concept of source text or source language, target text and target language. These are concepts which do not require much discussion. Now, in the process, you may encounter some phenomena or some text or some terminologies that would require you to, that would pose challenge and require you to come up with something in the target language. Some new terms would be required, maybe some kind of equals would be required. And for the purpose, you have something called equivalence. So there are some culture-specific terms, some culture-specific phenomena that are very difficult to express, sometimes even within the culture, or sometimes that's very difficult to translate in a different culture. Therefore, some authors have gone to the extent of saying that they are untranslatable. When they are untranslatable and the translator would not accept this, so the translator would propose something called equivalence. Similarly, you have two very opposite concepts of localization and foreignization. So when a concept, a terminology of a foreign language is brought into the local settings, a new term is coined so that, or something that relates with the local population and the language that is prevalent in the local settings. So that would be an instance of localization. Like you have internet, you have products, various international products that are brought into the Indian market, and then they are made available to the rural masses also. When they are made available to the rural masses, before that, the products descriptions, the key terms involved are all localized. This process can be reversed also. So something that is produced in the local setting is converted and sent to various languages abroad. And before they are sent to various languages abroad, these are foreignized. So these are presented in a foreign language to suit the requirements of the consumers. There are several domains at which translation is operating, and the domains are several levels at which translation is operating, and these operating levels, as you can understand, are very simple. These are beginning with sounds and sound patterns, going to the words and their parts, then sentence and their parts, and the larger level of sentences and paragraphs. Sometimes even gestures are also included. So any aspect that is, or any level that is associated with language is also associated with translation. That means translation activities are happening at all levels that we assign to languages. Let's also examine the perspectives that are associated with translation. So the term translation exists in several languages in slightly varying forms. So let us have a look at that. In, say, Bangla, you have Rupantar. In Hindi, you have Anuvad. And in Arabic, it's Tarjama. In German, it's Übersetzen. In Chinese, it's Fani. Latin, it's Translatio. Now, these are not just equivalent terms in different languages. These also point to the different ways in which the activity of translation has been perceived by these communities. So it's very important for us to understand that translation is not just a homogeneous or a singular or unitary practice. There are different forms, there are different ways in which languages of the world have understood translation, and then that's how it's existing. Similarly, for interpretation, which means the act of explaining meaning of something in the general parlance, but in the context of translation, interpretation would refer to that activity of language change in which oral media is included. So suppose I'm speaking things in Indian English right now, and the same is spoken by somebody else in, say, Hindi or Odia or Bangla, it would be an act of interpretation. Again, have a look at the different terminologies associated with it. In Hindi, it would be called nirvachan or ashu anuvad. In Urdu, it would be tafsir. In French, it is interpretariat, or in Latin, it is interpretari. Now, these different terms do not just point to the availability of several words or several terminologies. They also point to different items that these activities focus on. So the focus of translation and interpretation in different languages have varied. That is why these are mentioned as interpretation and translation in different perspectives. Now, if we look at what kind of translation, so Roman Jakobson provides us with three very interesting forms of translation, three different types. One is intralingual. You are aware of that. In the discussions, you must have come across the term. When the translation is happening within the language, it is intralingual. When it is across languages, it is interlingual. And when it is between two different forms, it is intersemiotic. This can be said that this idea, or Roman Jakobson's idea of translation, was at a larger level when he considers translation as a general term for all activities encompassing the enterprise of translation. You have several forms like site translation, human translation, machine edit translation, back translation, and retranslation. So back translation you might have come across. This refers to that translation in which the target text is retranslated, and just to see whether the target text achieved again is equal to or identical with the source text, or there is some difference. Similarly, a text is translated again to see whether there are instances of divergence. Various domains are there, and text types are there. So you see translation activities happening at literary level, religious, political, commercial, scientific, at the level of mass media. You have several domains where translation is happening. These are just to name a few. There may not be any area where translation is not having its role to play. Today, the academic domain is perhaps the biggest beneficiary of translation. Now, putting this in a global scenario, the top 10 languages translated in English are before you. In these languages, French appears on the top, and you'll be, I mean, the purpose behind presenting these languages before you is to show that Indian languages do not appear in the top 10 languages, and there is a lot that we as translators or we as language enthusiasts need to do. Similarly, if we look at the top 10 languages translated in India, we see English appearing on the top, followed by Sanskrit. Then we have Bangla, Hindi comes next, and even among like top 10 languages translated in India, we do not see all languages from India. You have English, Russian, and French coming into it. There are several other major Indian languages which do not feature among the top 10 languages translated in India. These are some major writers who are prominently translated in India, top 10 writers translated in India. And when we look at India's position, India ranks 35th among most translating nations, which is not a very positive sign, because considering the linguistic diversity and considering the prevalence of a long history of translation in India, India should have been among the top 5. And we see that Sanskrit ranks 30, Bengali ranks 39, Hindi ranks 45 in the most translated languages of the world. So these are like some facts that have socio-economic, cultural, and pedagogical implications. When translation is not happening prominently in Indian languages, we cannot expect the educational sector to benefit much. So when there is a growth, when there is development in some aspects, when there is a lot of development in some disciplines in the world, such developments will not happen in India unless they are available in translation in India also. So these are like activities which are very old, and then we see that they have not received much attention. These are intellectual activities, and there is a lot to do with transfer of technology, sharing of knowledge, and growth of our nation. So despite that, such developments have not happened prominently in these sectors, and that is why perhaps there is a need to look at them from fresh perspectives and engage with them meaningfully. So we look at the point once again. I mentioned in the beginning that translation, interpretation, and adaptation are very old activities. You all may be very willing to accept that translation is a very old activity, but then if we look on this point analytically, we'll realize that translation perhaps is preceded by interpretation. That means there has been a long history when writing or printing was not there. So when writing and printing was not there, and still the transfer of text, source text, was happening in the target text, then it was happening as interpretation. So the oral form of rendering of one text into another text, oral form of transfer was happening, and that was interpretation. Today, let us see how we consider interpretation. If we have to assign values at the socio-cultural levels, we see that translation still receives slightly higher value than interpretation. But then these are both very important activities which also can bring a lot of job prospects. The factors that are influencing translation and interpretation activities, let's have a look at them. Internal factors are source text and target text. That means difficulty level of the text or the structural difference between the two languages can cause difficulty. For example, if the two languages that are concerned belong to the same family, or they are adjacent, or they have shared vocabulary, there would be some kind of ease of translation and interpretation. But if the two languages concerned are from two very different families and they do not share lexical items, then there would be more difficulties in translating, because these languages also share their own worldviews. A lot of things may change in the process. There may be loss and gain also in the process. So these activities also have some external factors like the choice of language, who chooses what is to be translated in what language. These are decisions which are difficult to make, because anybody who is translating would require some kind of support, institutional support, and that would not be possible unless the institutions come forward or say there is some agency supporting the activity. There are cultural issues also associated, because texts which are selected for translation should be culturally, they should be relevant, and they should be endorsed by the culture that is represented. If not, then there would be problems. Then there are political decisions also, due to which we see that some texts have more values, some texts have less values, and texts of higher values are often taken up for translation and interpretation. So in the case of interpretation, what is very important is, or a very subtle difference that takes it from the point of oral media. Like I earlier said, the difference between translation and interpretation would be that of change of form, so modality. So when there is when I said that there is only difference of modality, I had actually undermined something. That is, in the case of interpretation, it is not just that the modality is changing, it is also that the interpreter has to hear and immediately transfer the message. It is not that the text is spoken now, the interpreter would get 2 days time, and after that the interpreter is speaking the same text. It does not happen that way. There are only two formats associated. Either the interpreter is simultaneously speaking that thing, or the interpreter sequentially interprets things. So when the interpreter is doing this process, the interpreter has to do some kind of guesswork. The interpreter has to understand the meaning in context. It is not just rendering of a message as it is. So a lot of language processing is involved. In fact, when I'm speaking to you right now, I am basically thinking in English and speaking to you. So only one language is involved. When somebody else has to interpret it for you, it would be understanding this. So processing is involved, and then again presenting it to you in your language. Again, processing is involved. So double processing is involved. Similarly, there is a like quick switch from one language to another language. Now, in doing so, the factors which are very important for us to understand are the following: aptitude, that means the skill of the interpreter to grasp the text, the main points spoken in the discussion, and also the aptitude to express the same in the target language. Now, this would not be possible only by possessing proficiency in two languages. So if I were bilingual and I assume myself to be a good interpreter, it would be wrong. Just being bilingual in two, or just being proficient in 2 or 3 languages does not make you a qualified interpreter, because I mean, this is a skill that has to be developed. This is a skill that one would require, one would be trained in, and perhaps for this reason all kinds of training programs do happen. Then there is also a factor called attitude. That means if the process or if the profession does not have positive attitude associated with it, then the activity would not be performed well, and people would do it with unwillingly. When they perform unwillingly, the performance would have several shortcomings. Now, again, suppose the person has positive attitude with it, and the person also has aptitude to learn these skills. Now, what else would be required? Say, suppose you wish to become an interpreter. You are all willing and you see there is a lot of profit associated with it, so you want to develop as an interpreter. What else would you require? You would require the ability to infer meaning. So if I speak something, I speak, say, half of a sentence, you should be able to guess what is coming next. You should be able to understand the literal as well as the metaphorical aspects of the language. You should be able to understand the denotative as well as the connotative meaning of the utterances. And you should also be able to anticipate what can come next from the things that have been spoken. So these are some skills that are expected of an interpreter. Proficiency and communication skills, of course, they are also very, very important here. So let's have a look at that. When we talk about aptitude for interpretation, I have tried to carry forward the nature-nurture debate of language acquisition to interpretation skills. So the nature-nurture debate of language basically talks about whether language is a natural endowment that humans have, or it is a nurtured thing. There are several discussions based on that. Like B.F. Skinner talked about nurturing, and he says that these are all like behaviors which are learned, whereas Chomsky negated that and said these are all natural developments, and humans are born with language and things like that. Now, I have tried to bring this idea to the debate of interpretation, and my view is that, or my question before you is that whether interpreters are born with interpreting skills, or these skills are developed through training. It would be very difficult to answer these questions because we have contrary examples in both cases, and maybe a midway path would be better. So like the nature-nurture debate settled with a midway path, we can also settle this debate of whether interpreters are born with such skills or they are trained. Like if we look at training programs for interpreters, or if we look at institutions that are offering training to interpreters, we will be surprised to see that the first training institutes have come up very recently, or formal studies on interpretation has begun very recently, maybe 50 to 60 years ago, not before that. Or in fact, more formal debates about interpretation come only in the late 90s. Then it's just 30 years. So that way, can we assume that interpreters were not trained before? No. In fact, interpreting services and interpretation trainings were there earlier also, but they were not formalized, or they were not recognized properly, or they were not institutionalized properly. Therefore, we can say that such ideas have existed in long past also. That means people did not fully depend on people born as interpreters. There may be an advantage. Some people are better at language skills. Some people may be better at interpretation skills, and therefore, with slight trainings, they may perform very well. Now, let us have a look at the attitude for interpretation, and you'll see that socio-cultural historical recognition of interpretation as intellectual activity, it has gone missing. It has not been there. There's a need to recognize interpretation as an intellectual activity, interpretation as a communicative act, and also with that, there would be a possibility of training machines for interpretation skills. These are all very long distant goals. Proficiency in language and communication skills are required. There is no doubt about that. There is no debate on that. Inferencing and anticipation anticipating. These are two very important points about interpretation. So if you were to develop as an interpreter, you would require inferencing skills. You should be able to anticipate also what would come next, and based on that you can develop into a good interpreter. Now, like the whole enterprise of interpreting has developed with sign language and gestures. So interpreting rests a lot with sign language and gesture, where like somebody can express the text using manual gestures, finger spelling, facial expressions, and things like that. Sorry?
Reena, can you mute your audio? Please proceed, sir.
Proceed?
Yes, sir.
All right. So popular sectors and domains in which interpretation activities or interpretation related activities are happening include business, mass media, conferences, courtrooms, travel and tourism sector, embassies, consulates. These are some areas which you can guess on your own also. These are some major areas which hire the services of interpreters. Now let us have a look at types. So there are two major types of interpretation. One is called simultaneous interpretation, where the interpreter speaks at the same time. It happens in the real time. Whereas the other form is called sequential interpreting, and that is like the speaker takes a pause after speaking a few sentences, and then the interpreter would express the same in the target language. There is another concept called relay interpretation. This is associated with situations in which the interpreter does not know either the source or the target language. One of these the interpreter does not know. So what happens is a pivot language is chosen. So the text would be interpreted in a different language, and then it would be reinterpreted in a different language. So that way it's called relay interpretation. Finally, like the message is conveyed in the target language, in the desired language. Then you have on-site or remote interpreting also. There are occasions in which you might also have experienced you are over phone and you are receiving guidance on certain things. So you have a machine which is set in a language that you don't understand, and you make a phone call and the customer care guides you on how to disambiguate the target language and make the machine functional for you. So such remote interpreting also is very interesting, because this happens in various domains, sometimes related to making the machines operational, sometimes even to receive directions when you are going somewhere. You have some very interesting types of interpretation, like sight interpretation, where somebody reads a document and speaks its content. Then you have whispering, like there would be a meeting like situation going on, and a person would be sitting just behind and speaking it in a very low pitch so that others don't hear it except the person to whom it is spoken. In various meetings, business meetings and political discussions also, we notice that interpreters would be sitting just behind the person to whom it is to be spoken, whereas on other occasions you will see people with headphones, and the interpreters would be performing from the booths. At times for travel and other purposes also, the services of interpreters are required. Some techniques that are very beneficial for interpreters, you have the following, like anticipation, which is very, very important. The interpreters guess what the speaker may speak next from the environment of the sentence, from the topic, from the theme of the discussion, from the tone and texture of the communication that is ongoing. So the interpreter guesses and then speaks. Sometimes the interpreter also takes notes, and in the process of taking notes, the interpreter takes notes down only that which is very, very important, that which is key point and should not be missed out. So the interpreter has the liberty to drop certain other things. And this is called salami technique, where cutting and simplification is also allowed. So the formal text can be spoken in an informal way, and sometimes even the academic text can be summarized and spoken to the person in simplified form. So in the process, you would have sometimes additions, sometimes omissions, sometimes generalization, sometimes it would be explained, sometimes there could be borrowing of the key term or the technical term, and things like that. In case of interpretation also, we notice that the practice is there, the practice is not formalized properly. That is why at the global level, not a single Indian language is appearing, but at the Indian level also, what we notice mostly is English is an important language in the pairs involved. So there is a need to recognize, there is a need to formalize and institutionalize the interpretation that is happening between Indian languages. So Indian language to Indian language interpretation has to receive recognition. And in these processes, the role of university departments, various manuals and training centers would be very, very important. And if these things grow properly, probably there could be schools and universities of interpretation that could offer licensing and recognition to interpreters. Today, the practice is happening, but these practices need some kind of official tags. When these things are studied formally in, say, university setups, then what we get is interpretation studies. And this name got currency mostly in 1990s, though it had come into occurrence long before, but then it gains more currency in 1990s. And in last 2 decades, a lot of developments have taken place. So main factors in interpretation would be to avoid errors, because in case of translation, there is a possibility of revision, because one can reread the text and compare the source and the target, whereas in case of interpretation, it is very difficult. It is very difficult because the requirement may be in real time, the requirement may be at short gaps, the requirement is such that the possibility of errors or omissions are very, very minimum. So apart from that, fidelity and faithfulness is required in the case of interpretation more than in the case of translation. So with these, the disciplines have emerged. Considering these debates, considering various factors, considering various practices, we see a kind of a growth of new disciplines called translation studies, interpretation studies, and that has been very, very important. Now let us have a look at something that is worthy taking note of, and that was the year 2017, when the United Nations recognized translation and interpretation as important activities that can bring together nations, that can cause harmony and peace in the world, and that is why they recognized 30th September as International Translation Day. In the case of India also, we noticed the role of various institutions like National Translation Mission, National Book Trust, Sahitya Academy. These are some important institutional initiatives that are causing a positive impact on the activities like translation. Of course, interpretation has remained out of the focus of these agencies, but then of course they can become part of these activities in future also. And if the National Education Policy 2020 were implemented properly, we can see a new institute coming up called Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation that will provide licensing and accreditation, formal training and degrees in translation and interpretation, and that way it would be a very good thing to happen. Now let us have a look at the third pillar of translation, the third pillar, which is very, very important, and that has not received much attention, not even as much as interpretation studies or interpretation. This is called adaptation. So adaptation is basically change of the medium itself. For instance, you take a novel that is presented as a movie, or you take a movie that is written as a story or novel. So in these cases, we see that the medium itself is changing. When medium changes, we call it adaptation. And this is also not a new process. In fact, it has been there for a very long time, because very often the plays were written first and they were performed. Very often the performance of written materials would vary from place to place. In all these instances, we noticed that adaptation was happening. Those who are involved are called adapters, and the process is called adapting. The formal study of adaptation would be called adaptation studies. This is also an interdisciplinary area that is setting its foot now in this country also. It's also relatively very, very new, and it has not received much attention. Now, let us look at what issues are involved in adaptation. There are several issues involved in adaptation. And the most important topic within adaptation is that of faithfulness itself. Like, what will happen to faithfulness in case of adaptation? In translation, this is a debate, and in translation, there is a possibility of expressing the entire content of the source text in the target text. In interpretation also, the faithfulness factor can be taken care of. What happens in case of adaptation, where there is a change of the medium itself? Again, there can be a graded level of faithfulness, and we shall see that in the few slides that come next. There is a plurality of platforms. Sometimes you'll see a written text performed on a stage. Sometimes you'll see a stage performance written as a story. Sometimes you'll see a written text performed as movies. Sometimes you'll see written text converted into video games. Sometimes you'll see video games converted into movies, and things like that. So let us have a look at other things, and also the justifications for adaptation. So the faithfulness debate, the ownership or proprietary factors, plagiarism issues are very important to see in the context of adaptation. And when we look at these factors more closely, we'll probably accept the fact that the ownership or proprietary are concepts which are relatively new. These are concepts which are not forever. In fact, these are concepts which have developed in last, say, 400 to 500 years only, or maybe 800 years. Now, the origin of an idea, the origin of a particular a particular set of knowledge would be very difficult to guess. It is very difficult. Today, you can say that the mobile technology has developed at a particular place, or the first country or the first person to bring out or invent something is Mr. So-and-so or such and such enterprise. But then the idea probably is very difficult to say or assign, to be assigned to an individual or an enterprise. Probably that has existed. So it's very difficult to agree to ownership or propriety, especially from the point of view or from the standpoint of adaptation. So that is why we say individual authorship is a new concept. Society earlier used to have collective ownership. Collective authorship was there. So you would find it very difficult to say who invented needle and who invented door, who invented a latch on the door. These things are very difficult to say. Like, all members of the community probably develop those things as a collective game. Now, another aspect which is very important for us to take is, or which justifies adaptation, is like retelling a story has its own value. Retelling with slight changes has its value, and retelling with slight changes has a creative aspect associated. Retelling is not just repetition. It is not just repeating. In fact, we need to understand that when we have a big epic, we'll see that several forms of it exist. That exists because it has existed by retelling and then with additions and deletions. We also see that when our largest texts, our religious texts, have all been oral earlier, and they were passing on from one generation to another generation. It was happening through retelling. Our biggest myths are also available to us through retelling. So today we cannot just say no, we don't agree with retelling and we will not accept retelling. We consider it plagiarism or we consider it faulty activities. No. In fact, the resistance, as I have mentioned in the earlier slide also, resistance to retelling or adaptation is a resistance to knowledge itself, because the vast amount of knowledge that we have today probably has become possible because of retelling only. Like our ancestors have kept informing us about various knowledge that they have gained. So from one generation to another generation, it has been passing through retelling also. Our knowledge about weather, about our knowledge about food, our knowledge about medicines, our knowledge about clothes, our knowledge about flora and fauna. All these things have passed on through retelling from one generation to another generation. And today, if in the name of faithfulness, if we just drop the activity of adaptation, probably will be at loss. So there is a need to retell, there is a need to associate it with contemporary technology, and there is a need to change the socio-cultural values associated with adaptation. Here I am presenting before you three forms of adaptation that were identified by Geoffrey Wegner, and he offers us one that is called transposition, where the text is presented same as it is. So there is no change in the text, or very minimum change in the text occurs when the medium is changed. So a novel is converted into a movie, or a movie is converted into a novel with minimal changes. The second he names commentary, where text is altered purposefully or sometimes accidentally, but the change is minimum, it is not much. The third form is called analogy, where the text is shown as a new work itself. So obviously it will have a lot of changes. So we have three forms of adaptation: transposition, commentary, and analogy. Main areas of adaptation, let's have a look at that. The main areas include literary or film adaptation, where written or printed material is converted into a film or play. You have examples like the movie Omkara, or Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, and things like that. So it's like you are watching the novel or book. Now, something that is written, which was very engaging, and it was assumed to be very interesting in multimedia format, and that is why it was converted. So the cast, characters, and the platform may vary. Now, these instances also have creative value. So we cannot just say that like one novel is there, and or say a written play is there, it is performed or it is converted into a movie, and that does not have value, because it is a kind of portrayal of that which was existing in the written form. No, it's not that. In fact, in the process, a lot of creative aspects are involved, a lot of creativity is involved. Then we also see novelization. It's an activity where movie is converted into the novel. So it's like reading the movie. And you have various examples. I have included something like The Third Man, Charade, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Total Recall, Fantastic Voyage. These are some examples. Now you may like to recall a time when audio cassettes used to provide movies. That means the movie was recorded on audio cassettes and people used to play it on tape recorders and experience the movie again. So this was again an instance of retelling. So that means human beings have a preference to hear again and again things that they like. What about remixing? Today, several songs that were popular earlier are presented with remixing. There may be debates on that. There may be debates on poor quality of remixing. But then there are poor quality of debates also, which say that such things should not happen at all. We stick to propriety, we stick to originality, we stick to fidelity, we stick to authorship. And that is what is being debated here in the discourse of adaptation studies. You also notice some video games which become very popular, they are converted into movies. And you have examples like Rampage, Pokemon, Detective Pikachu, and then Sonic the Hedgehog, and Werewolves Within. These are presented to you in a sequential manner, in the chronological order of their appearance. Today, we should also examine whether memes and memification process or poster cultures can also be considered instances of adaptation. And I think your intuitive answer to this question would be yes. I also agree to it. Like one part of a movie or a video clip or a poster that becomes very popular is presented in many ways. For example, recently there was a lot of heat wave in the northern part of the country and the temperature had gone above 45 degrees Celsius. At the same time, Bengaluru and Mysuru were experiencing temperature below 25. In fact, it was lesser than Shimla and Mysuru, the two popular hill stations. And a lot of memes came up stating, "Mujhe bhi Bangalore jana hai," or "Mujhe bhi Bangalore jane do," and things like that. We can also consider the new developments like augmented reality and virtual reality and Facebook's metaverse as instances of adaptation, because here what we see is two things. In the case of augmented reality, we notice the mobile phones or our tabs or screens convert into a new thing, and we experience some kind of world that is not real, or it appears to us very real, but it is enhanced, it is augmented by adding various features. Whereas in case of virtual reality, we put a kind of headgear and our vision is totally restricted, and the machine or computer presents before us a different kind of a world, and we tend to behave in that world. So a lot of these developments are taking place, and these are all in a sense, these are all instances of adaptation. Therefore, there is a need to consider adaptation studies as a very important area, and there is a need to look at these areas, whether these are translation or interpretation or adaptation, as areas where new trends are there, and there is a need for investing resources. We need to provide skill trainings to all these people who are interested in the area of translation or interpretation or adaptation. There is a need to ensure quality in the process. There's a need to have parameters that can ensure quality. There is a need to have regulatory bodies for translation, interpretation, and adaptation activities, and also centers that provide skills in these areas. So there are several motivations for future research in the case of translation and its associated disciplines, including interpretation and adaptation. And I have just presented before you some of them, like this can throw light on how translation, interpretation, and adaptation activities fail in some individuals, whereas they succeed in some individuals, both being bilinguals. So how training can cause change in the performance of translation, interpretation, and adaptation activities. How the human brain, bilingual brain, is able to perform these activities. these are some motivations I have presented before you. I also have some reading list for those interested in translation studies, or those interested in interpretation, or those interested in adaptation. Thank you so much for your patience. And if I have been able to make you interested in some of these topics, I would be very happy to answer further questions. Thank you so much.
Sir, you actually mentioned about the intersemiotic translation, like in the types of translations. So, as we know from linguistics, that semiotic is about science or related. It is related to science. So, can the American Sign Language be a part of like this intersemiotic translation when we are like interpreting the signs or symbols?
No, that would be an instance of interpretation, because that is mostly sign languages are interpreted. But then if you just consider another experience, when you are moving on road, you are driving and you see the red light, you stop. You see the orange light, you walk with, you proceed with caution. You see green light, you move without any problem. How are you able to convert these signs? No loudspeaker there to tell you that you should stop. There was no loudspeaker telling you to move. In fact, you associate some kind of meaning to that which was available as sign. Sometimes when you visit, say, a public toilet, you see the photo of a lady with skirt or with sari, and you understand that this is for ladies. And when you see the photo with hat or coat or with trousers or mustache, you understand that this is for gents. So you associate meaning with some signs or symbols, and that would be an instance of intersemiotic translation.
Sir, translator can convert written text from one language to another, and interpreter can convert oral text from one language to another. Is I am right?
Yes, yes. These are some differences proposed by various scholars. Some scholars do not believe in these differences, and they feel that all of it can be put under translation. But it is convenient for us to understand them as separate activities. So like you have said just now, written and printed materials transferred from one language to another language would be translation. Oral text transferred from one language to another language would be interpretation.
Yes, sir.
When the
Sir,
medium changes, it is adaptation.
सर तर्जुमा होता है या तर्जमा होता है?
These are two different ways in which it is pronounced. I think it should be acceptable as both, but tarjama is how it is written. Here you have a more reliable resource. Dr. Halim is there, who would throw light on the actual correct pronunciation of the term. Dr. Halim, can you?
Yeah, please. Farhina, Banu.
Yes, sir.
We are calling it tarjuma, but it is written like rajam. The basic word is ra, re, jim, mim. है ना?
Yes,
तो
sir.
रजम, उसी से मुतरजम, है ना? तो जिन पर हमेशा जबर आ रहा है ना सब पे, सिर्फ तर्जुमा के मामले में पेश हम लोग बोल रहे हैं, लेकिन एक्चुअली मुझे लगता है कि तर्जुमा ही है, तर्जुमा नहीं है.
Oh yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
In the Indian context, I have noticed a lot of people pronounce it tarjuma, but the word presented before you was Arabic. The Arabic speaking persons mostly pronounce it as tarjama, not tarjuma. So they say tarjama.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir, that is actually Tarjuma, a Telugu influenced word, sir. Actually, the mother tongue influence is there upon that particular term, sir. That is what I am perceiving. And whether I am right or not, I don't know, but that is my perception.
You are right to the extent that it is mother tongue influence on the pronunciation, because the word is a borrowed word, it's a loan word. But then
Yes, sir, yes.
of Telugu origin or Telugu influence, that is where I would like to disagree with you. I seek to disagree with you that this is a Telugu influence on the term. The term is of Arabic origin, And
Yes, sir, yes.
in different parts of the country, probably 2 different or 3 different pronunciation might also be possible.
Thank you so much, sir. We, there are, new areas emerging from translation studies, adaptation studies and interpretation studies. You've got to know a lot on this actually. And he, thoroughly, he brought a lot of, key concepts actually, and introduced it to us all here. I also did not know many, of the issues he, presented here. And thank you, sir. Thank you for enlightening us on the new emerging areas from translation studies. So, yeah. So,
Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to me.
thank you all.